Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to another episode of Manifesting Muslimah. I'm your host, Zara Pedersen, and in today's episode we are going to be talking about suffering and ease, which sounds very dramatic, but it actually doesn't have to be all that dramatic. In reality, what we're talking about today is a bit of a human trend, I would like to say. I kind of wanted to say for specifically within the Muslim world, but actually as I was thinking about this, it kind of goes a bit further than just what we see within the Ummah, and I will get into that and all of this a little bit further on. But this human trend of romanticizing suffering to make it almost something that makes you a better person or a wiser person, more knowledgeable, worthy of something more than other people because you have suffered for it. And specifically asking you instead to choose ease rather than that suffering. So let's talk a little bit about it. Okay, so suffering, as I said, very dramatic word here. And specifically, I would say that the lifestyle of suffering is something that we quite often see in the Muslim world, where there's a general consensus, while perhaps not necessarily spoken, is definitely something that is sort of subconsciously hinted at quite often in conversations and when we are talking about other people and just how we're looking at each other in this dunya. And we're almost romanticizing suffering. In fact, we're not almost romanticizing it. We are romanticizing suffering specifically, where the subtext within the text is basically, if you're not suffering, you're not a good Muslim. If you're not suffering, you're not going to go to heaven. If you're not suffering, you're not worthy of Allah's blessings or Allah's mercy or paradise, essentially, which I think is a very damaging messaging to be putting out there. And please, I'd love, by the way, to hear from you guys on any of this. If you felt the same thing, this is something that I feel is very prevalent. Again, not just in the Muslim communities, and I will get into that as well, but specifically within the Muslim communities, I see it as something that is very damaging to our understanding of Allah, of this dunya, and what is required of us in this dunya as well. Because one thing that you've probably have gathered by now is that I don't believe that this dunya is meant for us to suffer. I believe that this dunya is a test. Of course, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us several times in the Quran. So not to get too caught up in this dunya, because this is just a test for the akhirah, the hereafter. But that this test is not meant to be one where we are suffering necessarily, that we can enjoy it. This can be a pleasurable test. It's allowed to be a fun test. It's allowed to be a test where we are enjoying ourselves, where we're living good lives as servants of Allah, and still expect and be given more in the akhirah, in paradise, inshallah. But I do see that there's a huge misconception around what this dunya is, where to the point where in the Ummah specifically, we have come to this understanding that the more you suffer, the more worthy you are of Allah, of being a Muslim, of Jannah, of, the blessings of Allah. And I think this is very damaging because it's romanticizing a state of being that is not benefiting us. And it is romanticizing a state of being that is potentially damaging, not just to like our overall mental health, but our relationship and understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our roles. Because Allah did not create us to be suffering. Allah created us to serve Him. And He created hell for the suffering. This dunya is the test, and if we fail the test, our souls will go to hell where the suffering will happen. That is not meant for this dunya, although, let's be very, very real about this, there are or can be elements to this dunya where suffering can be a part of it. A part of your journey is suffering. And for some people, we know and understand, have a whole lifetime of it because they are born in specific places around the world with certain ailments, are in war zones, things like that. But that is a very different thing to those of us who have the privilege of having the choice of other things. And that is so important for us to remember, that the point of this dunya is not to suffer or suffering. It is an element that when you endure this suffering, whatever may happen in your life that is causing you to suffer for a period of time. Again, we're not talking about people in war zones or people who have been afflicted in different ways than those of us who are far more privileged than that. We are talking about those of us, and I am specifically talking to you and I here, because I know that if you're listening to this podcast and you're even remotely looking into the concept of law of attraction, that you're in a position of choice, autonomy, and power, and over a lot of other people in this world. So for that reason, this is specifically for you and me. So that's who I'm talking to, and I just want to really make that clear here. When you are going through a period of suffering or perceived suffering, it is not a state for you to stay in, number one, but what the rewarding aspect of that will be is not the fact that you suffered. It is how your mindset was during your suffering. Were you still grateful? Were you still turning to Allah? Did you have patience, sabr? Those are the elements in suffering that are to be rewarded, not necessarily the suffering itself. And I think the general understanding somewhere along the line in the Ummah has kind of got it a little messed up, where, the more you're suffering, the more Allah loves you, and so you're going to be rewarded, where not necessarily. That's not the case. It is how you're dealing with it. How you deal with that test of the suffering in this dunya, how you move past the suffering, how you choose to handle the suffering, how you choose to handle yourself and your emotions during the suffering. That is where the rewards are, and that is what makes you favored by Allah. It is not that I will put you in a position of suffering for the sake of suffering. It is, I will put you through the suffering as a test, as a trial, to see how you deal with it. And so it is so important for us to remind ourselves of this. But I think the problem, as I said, this is something that I feel is sort of the subtext to the overall text. I think it's more of a mindset in the Ummah than it is something that is necessarily spoken of. So I can appreciate if this is not something that you have come across, alhamdulillah if you haven't, but it's certainly something that I have seen time and again, and I also see it quite often in the mindset of some of the women that I coach, where there's almost a willingness to put oneself back into suffering, because the suffering has been glamorized and romanticized to a point where one believes that this is the state to be in order to be favored by Allah. And that to me is very sad, actually. It is very, very sad to come across this mindset in people, because it really prevents a lot of people from achieving greatness and really having a dunya that can bring them a sense of joy, calm, ease, peace, love, all of those great things, as well as also, benefiting them for the akhirah. And so when I come across this mindset, it is very clear to me that it is because that there's a general consensus around suffering that can be very damaging to the individual, where the individual might subconsciously, at the very least, get in their own way, self-destruct, sabotage whenever they get close to something that might be good, maybe completely ignore things that could take them out of their suffering, because it's almost more wanted to stay in that state of suffering. Do you understand what I'm getting at? You might actually, in my just saying this, you might recognize some of this for yourself, or you might even recognize this as somebody that you know, somebody that you've tried to sort of help, but for some reason they just don't want to be helped. You bring them a lot of suggestions and a lot of help physically, mentally, to overcome whatever might be happening in their life, but for whatever reason it feels like they're choosing the suffering over the ease. And so that might be something that you might be recognizing. I can think of quite a few people in my life. I mean, obviously now I'm also a coach, so I see this perhaps more than the average person does, but I see this a lot, and I can think of a lot of people who are stuck in this mindset. And the mindset, while hurting them in this dunya, is so glamorized and romanticized in their minds that it can be very difficult to break up with this notion that Allah does not want us to suffer. Allah did not create us to suffer. Allah created the suffering, the actual suffering, for the people that are to be punished in hell, not for the good souls. The good souls are going to go through trials and tests in this dunya, and some are going to be more difficult than others. And for some, as I said, there may be either perceived suffering or actual suffering going on. But it is not a state of being necessarily. It is that is rewarded. It is how you deal with the suffering. I spoke a little bit, or I mentioned earlier, that this isn't just something that we're seeing in the Muslim Ummah. This is also something that is sort of like a mindset across the world, actually. And I want to hear if from you guys, if you've heard from this as well. Either comment on this if you're listening to this on Spotify, or send me a DM over on Instagram. But we see it quite a lot also in the people that we look up to, celebrities and stuff like that, coaches, entrepreneurs. We see it quite a lot in the people that we look up to, in that we almost like the person more if they've gone through suffering. We respect the person more if they've gone through some suffering in their life. I remember when I first was setting up my first business back in 2014, and throughout the years in London, I was very heavily listening to a lot of self-help books about entrepreneurship and things like that. And I can't remember which book it is. I mean, if you've been here for a hot minute, you know that I'm not the kind of person that can, pull information like that out of the top of my head. I remember the information, but I don't remember the reference. So, it is what it is. And it's the same, of course, with this. But I remember listening to an audiobook where I remember it was a female, and she said, you don't have to suffer in order for you to be worthy of sharing your message. And this was specifically around people who are coaches. And it really rung so true to me, because I kept thinking to myself at this point, because I wanted to go into life coaching and I was still doing personal training, and I thought, who am I? I was too young at the time. I felt like I was too young at the time. I was probably in the beginning of my, maybe at the beginning of my 30s or something, end 20s, beginning 30s. And I felt like I had so much to give in terms of life coaching, and I felt like I was already doing it anyway, which I actually was with my PT clients on the side, but there was still this part of me that felt like, I have to have a reason, why people would follow me. And if I have overcome something great and grand, then that'll give people this reason to trust me. Like, I'm not just this happy-go-lucky, and then I just happened to stumble into the world of coaching. And I almost felt like it had to be a part of my brand in order for me to be accepted as a coach. And that kind of stopped me, because I felt really bad about monetizing on past traumas and stuff. but that was, listening to that sentence from this audiobook, I just remember it really put things into consideration for me about how I also was looking at people that I was perhaps looking up to or revering in the same industry or whatever I might have done at the time, and looking at every single one of them almost had to have had a story to overcome. I had to be able to see that growth for myself almost before I could believe in them. And I just remember that being a real thing for me, and a real wake up call. So I know that it's also something that also happens in the non-Muslim world, where we're almost sort of elevating a person's status if they have suffered, which again, it doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with the person's skills or abilities, but it's just like this human need to almost feel validated, like, by this other person, like, oh, you have gone through it and you've come onto the other side and done better, so that is the thing that I want to achieve because maybe I feel like I'm going through something. But what we're ultimately doing is romanticizing the suffering, when we're practically, if we don't have this storyline where there is suffering, we almost feel like we have to create the suffering in order for us to have the storyline. And the problem with that is that we don't know which storyline, quote unquote storyline, is the one that's going to make it for us. So we can inadvertently constantly be seeking out the suffering, even if there is no need for it. And that is the trap with this. There are other places in mainstream, again, outside of the Ummah, where suffering, again, is romanticized, glamorized. We do it with celebrities in general, like singers, actors and actresses, where, somebody like Oprah. Now, this is somebody that I used to look up to quite a bit, not anymore. I have grown up and I have seen perhaps more of the reality of what Hollywood life, what those people might have to do for that, and I'm not very impressed with it. But back in the day, I was very impressed with Oprah, and I remember when she was still coming up, because I was, growing up with the Oprah Winfrey Show, probably like many of you were. And I remember that a lot of her backstory, it was very much emphasized, and still is to this day. Let's be so very real. She's lived, the majority, and I'm going to say that the majority of her life at this point in extreme luxury and privilege, but a short period of her life was full of suffering or hardship. And very difficult things that she had to go through. I absolutely am not going to minimize any of that, but we still look to that small portion of her life to justify her today, even though she spent the last 30 years of her life in extreme wealth and luxury, and a lifestyle that that many of us can only dream of, right? But we will still look at those one or two things to justify her being where she's at now, because that makes us feel better about it as well. We don't like it when people have been born with a silver spoon. Is it in their mouth or in their bum? I can't remember. Is silver spoon up your bum? I can't remember. I don't know how this saying goes. But it's almost like we hope for their downfall because they haven't had the suffering. So we almost don't even care about their intentions because we want them to suffer. If they haven't suffered, they're not deserving of it, And yeah, of course, there are exceptions to the rule and whatever. But generally speaking, no, we seek out that suffering, we seek out the hardship because that makes them quote unquote relatable. But not everybody suffers, and not everybody has to suffer. There's a lot of people don't have suffering in their lives. They're very lucky people. They're very blessed in that aspect. I'm sure they're tested in many other ways that we are very much unaware of, but they're not suffering in the way that we understand suffering as laymen's, as regular riff-raffy people, right? We don't see that, but we still want to feel acknowledged by them suffering in the way that we suffer before we want to acknowledge their success or that they are worthy of having the things that they do have. I don't know. I find it to be a very strange relationship that we have around suffering. And I do believe that a lot of people in the Ummah use Islam specifically to validate suffering and staying in a state of suffering. And I find it to be so very damaging because it keeps you playing small and it keeps you in a mindset where you self-sabotage. And here's the thing, my darling, and I want you to remember this: you can experience suffering and still choose ease. You can experience suffering but still choose ease. Ease is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you might go through a test that's very difficult and you might suffer a bit through it or a lot through it. But you can find ease in suffering. And the ease in suffering is exactly what Allah has given us. It's the whole guide is in the Quran, by being patient, by having sabr, by being grateful still for what you do have, by praising Allah, by coming to your salah. Those things are bringing ease in a situation that otherwise would be very stressful and very damaging. And that is not to say that we should stay in suffering just because we have those tools. It is to remind us that there is a way out of the suffering. We can suffer, but the moment we turn to Allah, there is ease. There is ease. So we can choose ease even through suffering. And also choose ease even when there is no suffering. You're allowed to choose ease. So instead of self-sabotaging and thinking to yourself, oh, things have been going really, really well lately, this is actually something we've discussed quite a bit in the membership group about one of the members said, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop because things were going really, really well for her. And she was like, oh, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. When's the consequences going to come? When's the other side of the coin going to show its ugly head and whatever? And it's like, what if there is no other shoe? There is no other shoe to drop. All the shoes have dropped. You're okay just to live in ease now. It's okay just to have ease in your life. There's nothing wrong with it. Allah's not going to punish you for having a life in ease. There's nothing in Islam that says you have to suffer for heaven. No, you got to strive for heaven, but that's different than suffering. Very different indeed. It says you will suffer if you fail this test in this dunya. Yes, then you go to hell and you will suffer greatly. But there's nothing that says that you can't live a life in ease in this dunya and still be rewarded with heaven in the akhirah. And this mentality of wanting almost to expect suffering to happen just because there has been ease in your life is very damaging as well, because this is where the self-sabotage comes in. We start looking for things that are wrong. We start looking for things where we can delay things subconsciously, where we can overthink things, where we can hesitate, where we can have doubt, where we can do whatever it might be that basically puts a spanner into the works and stops it and sabotages it, so that we'll go back again to the state that we are familiar with, which is suffering. The state that has been revered by many communities throughout the world, which is suffering. The state which we almost would want to accept more and deem more worthy than ease and flow, which is suffering. Do you see where I'm getting at with all of this? So I want to ask you, are you romanticizing suffering in your life? It might not be in every single aspect of your life or like an overarching theme in your life, but there might be a specific part in your life, a specific thing where you have been choosing the suffering, where you have been choosing to make it more difficult for yourself than it has to be, where you are choosing that this can never be that great because that would be too easy, so I will continuously self-sabotage. And for some of you, that might be with your partner, finding a partner or maintaining a partner. Maybe you don't believe that you're allowed to have a good love, a good husband in your life, so you keep trying to nitpick and find arguments and stuff with the people that you meet, and that's preventing you from finding a partner or keeping a partner. It could be in business, making money, that it feels too easy for you to make money in one way, so you start feeling guilty and like, oh, that can't be right. This feels too easy, so I'm gonna shut this business down or I'm gonna make it more complicated for myself, or do something that basically makes it more difficult for me to make the money that otherwise would have come to me easily. It could be in weight loss and appearances, health, even weight gain, that we start overthinking it and we start telling ourselves stories around what we can and cannot do, what we're capable of and what we're not, and what we like and don't like. So we start saying, I don't like exercising, but in reality, you've just not found the exercise type that's good for you or that you like to do. or I don't like dieting, but in reality it's because you've been going on too many strict diets instead of finding one that works for your body and your hormonal system and everything. But do you see, like, you can have in one specific area of your life where this suffering tends to come in. It can be with friends and family, finances, your home, your living situation, with yourself, the way you view yourself, your mental health, your anything. It could be with anything. Or you could be one of those people where you constantly feel like, pardon my French here, but your life is constantly going to shit, you know, that everything's crashing and burning around you all the time, that you can never catch a break. Again, that could be you choosing the mindset of suffering is honorable. It makes me a better Muslim. It makes me loved by Allah even more. And so you might be doing things that is basically contributing to the narrative that'll keep you stuck in suffering, rather than you choosing the mindset of ease and moving towards ease in your life in this dunya. Okay, my darling, that's just a couple of things for you to think about. Again, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this subject. And if something I said really spoke to you or made you think, or if you agree or don't agree, I just love to hear from you in general. Thank you to everybody who reaches out to me. I absolutely love getting messages from you over on my Instagram. Please do reach out over on my Instagram, because that is where I can send voice notes back, because I can't be bothered texting, to be honest with you, and I can just say so much more in a voice message than I can over a text. So at Manifesting Muslima, that's where it's at. If you want to reach out, if you want to suggest a topic for the podcast, anything like that, or if you just want to say hi, I also love that. Anything really goes. So thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I'll be back again later on in this week with another one. But until then, my darling friend, please don't forget to live in love.